Well, welcome to the Striving for Eternity Academy School of Systematic Theology. We welcome you to class. We are grateful that you are joining us. And as we start into our second book of 4 books, we are in book number 2, which is titled God's Gift to Man. In this, we are going to deal with the theological doctrines of man, of sin, and salvation. Okay, man, sin, and salvation. Hope you have your syllabus. If you're an enrolled student, if you're not an enrolled student, I would encourage you to consider enrolling as a student of the Academy. One of the things you get is the syllabus. That way, right? Okay, over here. The syllabus. And so that's one thing that you get, but there's some other benefits that we have. And we are always, last week we did an interview. We're always afraid when we put Cy on, it kind of scares everyone away. So there may not be as many students this week watching. He has that effect? No. But we are going to talk about today the creation of man, which when we get into this, we're going to see that some people may end up asking, well, after the interview that we did with Cy on presuppositional apologetics, doesn't this kind of undermine some of that? Because we're going to talk about some false views, and you're going to see that we're not. It's not going to be, because we're not going to try to prove God exists by attacking false views of the creation of man. But we are starting now with this new syllabus. We do want to welcome all of the new students that have come out, that have enrolled this week. And so we hope that you have your syllabus in time. And so we will begin this class by looking at, in book number 2, we are looking at the gift of man. We're going to start in section 1, speaking specifically of the doctrine of man. And we'll start with lesson 1. That's usually good to start with lesson 1. We're going to start with the creation of man. We're going to start by looking at the creation of man. Now, this particular study on the origin of man is called anthropology. All right? The study of man, that's your first blank in your syllabus there, anthropology. And what we have there is that in this lesson, we're going to cover this specific lesson today. Maybe we'll get through all of it today. We'll see. We're going to cover the creation of man according to the doctrine of man. So we're going to have 2 key questions that we're going to have in this lesson. And they are, how was man created, and how is man procreated? Okay, so those are the 2 that we're going to look at. Now, there is a lot that we can look at when we get into the origin of man, because there are whole genres of books put out by creation scientists that will cover the areas of the origin of man. And so what we're going to see is that when we look at this, there's a whole lot more that we could go into. So we're really going to just touch the tip of the iceberg of some of these things. We're going to get into giving you an overview so that you have enough to understand what are the biblical views, the unbiblical views, and why we would say that, what issues they have with them. And then we're going to get into some very interesting theological issues of how man procreates. So let us begin, and we are going to start with the origin of man. The origin of man. Now, as we look at the origin of man, in studying the original creation of man, we need to first address some false views of how man was originally created. And then we're going to examine the biblical account of man's actual creation, okay? Because there are some false views that people have, okay? And the one that's, if you're even remotely paying attention to false views of the origin of man, Especially if you've been raised in some of the American school systems, you're very familiar with being forced to learn the false view called evolution. Evolution. And I'm being quite clear that that is a false view. There's no reason that when people argue that evolution is true, that we as Christians need to fear and be like, oh no, they're bringing up the E word. Oh, now we're going to get into all this scientific stuff that I don't know how to handle, and oh, what am I going to do? Yeah, don't worry. First of all, remember that if you're talking to an unbeliever, all right, they already know God exists. It's not even up for debate. It's not a discussion. God said it. They know it. They might suppress that. That's their problem. But what we end up having when we look at this is we will have times that we will be challenged with all these people arguing for evolution. And there are a great number of professing Christians that have been duped by this. I'm on the flip side. I actually started out as an evolutionist, having a background in science, and evolved to becoming a creationist. So I guess maybe I do believe in evolution. Just a thought. But what we end up seeing, though, is that when we are challenged, the argument is often laid as if you don't accept evolution, you're somehow just a knucklehead. You're dim-witted, you're not understanding, you can't comprehend. And typically what they're really arguing is they can't support their worldview, and so they want to belittle you so you don't challenge theirs. That's really what's going on. Evolution is full of so many huge holes that it really doesn't take much to dismantle. You don't need a scientific degree to understand the issues. And so what I want to do is give you first what evolution is as defined, and then we're going to kind of dismantle it and refute it. And one of the things you'll often see, if you go to Smithsonian down in Washington, as I have done, and you go down there and you look, and they're going to have some plaques on evolution, or the history of Natural History Museum, and they have these plaques, and it basically gives the view that's very interesting, because what they'll say in these museums is that we creationists believe that there has never been any change whatsoever. No, we don't believe that. See, that's called a false argument, because it's a logical fallacy that they're setting up a straw man argument so that they seem like they're really smart. Yeah, but everybody knows that there are changes within a kind. Just that simple, okay? Within a kind. So when we talk evolution, I want to give you a definition, then I'm going to try and break this down a little bit more so that we understand what is and isn't understood when people talk evolution. All right, so evolution defined is both the body and soul of man descended from lower animals by a completely natural process, entirely by inherent forces. So what they're saying is both your material being and your immaterial being. Oops, that's kind of a problem, isn't there? How can material things create immaterial? Okay, we'll get there. But that is a problem they have. You see, now, often what you'll do is you'll get them and they'll want to skip right over that question because they can't answer that question, right? Someone can't argue that. So the reality is when people get into trying to prove something like evolution, they skip over the things they can't explain, like the fact they know God exists, the fact that life can't come from non-life, the fact that immaterial can't come from material, all these problems, but they just want to skip right over that. We'll pretend that doesn't exist. And we'll just get to what we see. And they'll argue, well, we see that there is changes. Well, okay, what are those changes? Those changes are in the material, not the immaterial. And one of the things that you see is there's two realms. Now, some people call it micro and macro evolution, micro being small changes, macro being large changes. Micro evolution, or what is really properly called special evolution, is really what we'd call genetics or DNA. It is adaptation, it is the loss of genetic material that causes changes in the next generation, but that next generation still remains whatever the previous generation was. In other words, cats don't give birth to dogs, they give birth to cats. And though they may lose information, they still give birth to something in the cat family. Same with a dog. If you take two wolves and you take the two wolves and you put them up in one pair of wolves in Alaska, and take the same pair of wolves that are identical, same genetic makeup, and you put them in, say, the Sahara Desert, you're going to find within several generations that the wolves up in Alaska, that those that are in the next generation that have shorter hair are probably going to die out before they have a chance to reproduce. And so over a couple of generations, maybe 100 generations, they're going to completely lose the information in the genetics to have short hair. The reverse will happen to those in the desert. That is micro or special evolution. That's real science. That's something we can see, we can observe, we can reproduce, we can test on it. That's real science. But just because that's real science doesn't mean the leap of faith that people do is real science. The leap of faith is this, that because we see micro or special evolution, therefore macro or general evolution must be true. In other words, that one kind of animal produces another kind of animal given enough time. Okay? So when we look at the definition explained, we're dealing with the fact that people are arguing when we look at the definition, people are arguing for a view, okay, that is really they're doing a bait and switch, would be the best way I can explain it. Okay, they take something that they see in science that everyone agrees with, creationists will agree with, evolutionists will agree with, and then they say, well, since that's true, therefore, well, it's that therefore that there's no scientific evidence for. And when we look at, so the first view that we have is evolution. We explained it. Let's look at a refutation of that, because I think the first one that I almost slipped into giving you the first argument. So taking evolution and refuting it. Evolution refuted, apart from addressing the components of the theory, there's basically 5 different problems that we're going to look at when we look at evolution. Okay? And so we're going to look at these as just 5 things that you can have to know. And again, I'm not arguing this so that you'd sit there and try to prove, well, hey, look, evolution is wrong, so God exists. Bad argument. Okay? That doesn't convince somebody. Okay? Trying to argue that evolution is not true, therefore God exists, is almost as bad of an argument as, special evolution exists, therefore general evolution exists. It's kind of the same thing. All right? God exists and they know it apart from proving evolution true or not. Okay? And we're going to see in a moment that believing in God doesn't automatically make you a creationist. All right? So just so you know that. But let's take a look at the first one. When we want to refute evolution, if you look in your syllabus, you see the very first refutation that we have there is that there is no evidence of evolution is still ongoing. That's your blank there, ongoing. Now, when I'm using evolution in this sense, I'm using it by that definition I gave, which really is not the special or microevolution, but really the general or macroevolution. It is the concept that we evolved from lower forms of animals, okay, both body and soul. I'm saying that just so that you understand that when we look at the special evolution, genetics or DNA, that is true. We do observe that. That's still ongoing. But we look at the process that people argue to try to prove there is no God, and that's what they're doing it for. They believe in evolution because they have a presupposition they're trying to wishfully thinking hold to as true, being that there is no God, which is always kind of funny. They argue that we're not supposed to start with God as a presupposition, but they want to start with no God as a presupposition. That's kind of silly. So, but that is what they're doing. And now they have to come up with a way to explain you and I without God. Thus, evolution. And if you actually read what evolutionists write, especially in the trade journals, you'll see very clearly that that is the issue. That is what they are trying to prove. Just read in a scientific journal this week where they think they finally found a positive mutation. And the first whole executive summary of the article goes on to say that this will be the first positive mutation that they found, and this proves evolution is true. And then if you keep reading the whole article, it basically shows that they actually don't have any evidence for the claim. Oops. And that's what they do. They make a claim, and just making the claim doesn't make it true, okay? So, the first thing is, when we say that there's no evidence that it is still ongoing, when we look at the scientific evidence, the actual evidence of science, those things that we all have, okay, regardless of how you interpret it, okay, when we look at the evidence, we don't see anything that shows that this general evolution is still going on. In other words, when we look at cats giving birth, they give birth to cats. When we look at birds giving birth, they give birth to birds. That's what we observe, okay? That's what we can reproduce. What we don't see and we don't understand is, or we don't observe is a cat giving birth to a dog, all right? So there's no evidence that evolution is still ongoing. In other words, the idea being that if evolution is true, or at least they believe it was in the past, we don't see the evidence for it. And it should be ongoing today. I mean, think about how many millions and millions and millions of mutations there has to be and changes there has to be of one kind becoming another kind. We should be seeing all of those things. We should be seeing some evidence that evolution is still, that general evolution is still happening today, but we don't see it. So the first argument, or first refutation that we have for for evolution, getting ahead of myself, for evolution would be that there's no evidence that evolution is still ongoing. What this also touches on is also the fact that for evolution to be true, they have to assume that everything that is happening today has always been the same way. And yet, there's a slight problem with that, because everybody accepts that there was some major catastrophe worldwide, whether you want to believe in a worldwide flood or a worldwide ice age. But everyone knows it wasn't all that long ago that something major wiped everything out. So what you end up having is a major problem. Because if evolution is true, if it's true, and we have as many different species and different families of animals that we see today, we immediately should realize that this should be happening so often that we have tons and tons of evidence of it ongoing. And yet, we don't. You see the issue. Even if you say, well, there was an ice age several thousands of years ago, 10, 20,000 years ago, was, you know, I think about 15 to 20,000 years is what the secular scientists would argue was the dating of the last ice age. Some actually see a newer ice age within the last 10,000 years, but they all realize that it would have wiped everyone out. So what does that mean? It means we don't have enough time for evolution to start over again. I mean, evolution had to start and give us these great big dinosaurs, and then all of a sudden get wiped out and start over again. There's not enough time. You see, when they talk millions of years, they're forgetting about, their own ice age, which wiped everyone out and had to start over. Okay? There should be so much evidence of evolution like ongoing today that we should be able to find it everywhere. We should see lots of transitional forms, something that's in the middle of being one thing or another, but that gets us to something we're going to get to in a moment. Let's look at the second one. I already touched on this. Number 2 is that the science of genetics, that's your blank there, genetics. The science of genetics proves that the theory of evolution is impossible. Okay? Science shows that the DNA can only lose information and not gain it. Simple creatures cannot develop into more complex creatures. In other words, you have an amoeba that to Darwin seemed like such a simple thing. A single-celled organism that was a simple form, and yet it isn't simple when we understand DNA. Now, Darwin knew nothing of DNA. It was known at the time. He knew nothing about it. Fine. But what we end up seeing is that when we look at this, we see that in the within the DNA, an amoeba has the same extremely complex DNA. All right? Therefore, it's not so simple. It may be more simple than you and I because the instruction set is different, but it still has the same language and basic parts that are needed for the DNA, for that language, okay, that we can know that it's not so simple. Okay? Now, what do we know of DNA? Genetics. Real science that we can observe, that we could reproduce. That is following the scientific method. And what do we learn? We learn within DNA that there is the loss of information. In other words, like I gave you in the example, the 2 wolves that you put up in Alaska will lose the genetic makeup for short hair. The 2 wolves in the desert will lose the genetic makeup for long hair. That's real science. Okay? That is the science of genetics. Real science. And it proves that the evolution of gaining more information, gaining more complex information is impossible because we can't gain the information, we lose it. You can only get the DNA makeup one of 2 ways. One way is the way most of the second generation gets it. They get it from the first generation, their parents. They get the genetic makeup of their parents. Okay? The second way is a mutation, something that changes within the gene that is not from the parents, but is a mutation. Problem is, as I already said, no scientist has found a single positive mutation. That's the problem. They'll say they exist, and they'll explain that, well, we would get the way we are from looking at positive mutations that occur. Name one. When you read the scientific journals, they know they don't exist and they're looking for it. And when they get something they think might be close, they'll even explain it, as I said in this article that I read this week, where they'll say this is the proof. But when you actually read the article, they don't have the evidence that it actually is anything other than a claim. Okay? So when you look at genetics, genetics actually proves evolution is impossible. Well, then you go, well, wait a minute. Why do so many people believe it? Oh, that's easy. Romans chapter 1. Because they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Do you remember what Jesus said? Jesus said, to the religious Pharisees, the reason you do not believe the things I tell you is because I tell you the truth. Essentially, what's he saying? If he would have lied to them, they would believe him. If he wouldn't tell the truth, they'd believe anything because they're too busy suppressing the truth. When a person suppresses the truth, they will believe any lie that helps in that suppression. It's a blind faith. Evolution and atheism is absolutely a blind religious faith. Okay? And it is because they ignore the evidence that is right in front of them. Here's the irony. The evidence that they use to prove evolution, in other words, they use genetics and looking at this special evolution, and they use that to try to bait and switch people into believing general evolution. Yeah, it's that very special evolution, genetics, that proves the general evolution is impossible. That's the irony. That's the thing that gets funny with them. And so, one of the things I love to do with these people is point out the fact that they have a blind faith, a religious belief. It drives them absolutely bonkers, okay? Because they'll try to argue that they don't, but the science doesn't support what they claim is science. They're using science as a philosophy, all right? So, if we look at evolution, as defined as man descending from lower animals, both body and soul, we can refute them a couple ways. One, there's no evidence that evolution is still ongoing. Two is the fact that the science of genetics or DNA proves that evolution is impossible because DNA proves that we can only lose information and not gain it. Number three in your syllabus there is that evolution cannot explain the lack of transitional forms. Okay, let me explain what a transitional form, that's your blank there, transitional forms. A transitional form is something that if evolution was still ongoing, we should see lots of. A creature, a kind of animal, and the Bible doesn't talk about species or families, it talks about kinds, okay? What specifically is a kind? Is it a species? Is it a family? Well, let's stop right there for one moment just to mention the fact that science recently came up with this categorizing of animals into different types of families and down to species and things like that. You don't see that in the Bible. And so what a lot of people want to do is try to argue that the Bible, when it talks of kinds, is talking species, and then they'll show how they could take some different plants, and those plants can show that they can make a different species. That's not what a kind would be. The Bible says, and we'll look at later in this lesson, is that animals gave forth after their kind. A dog kind, a cat kind, a bird kind, a fish kind, mammal kind, rat kind, whatever the kind is. It'd probably be closer to a family. But we can't be exactly sure because God's categorizing of the animals is different than the scientists today are trying to classify them. All right? So, that being said, we don't see these transitions between one kind of animal to another. Now, you'll get some people that will try to say, oh, look at the platypus. Is the platypus really a transitional form, or is it just a platypus? I mean, the fact that it has a bill like a duck, does that make it some transitional form between a duck and a reptile? I mean, it's like it doesn't. It is kind of funny when the atheists get upset with Ray Comfort when he puts these silly pictures of, a dog's head on a bird's body, and he calls it a dog bird. And they say he's using mockery. But that would be a transitional form. That is exactly what we should see. If we see these transitional forms, we should see some animal that is in between two animals, clearly, and we should see it moving from one kind to a different kind. The problem is we don't see the platypus being something closer to a duck or anything else in a middle. You see, we see the platypus always being a platypus. When we look at the fossils of a platypus, we find them still being a platypus. This is the issue. We should see these transitional forms going from one kind to another kind, and we don't see it. Okay? Evolutionists cannot explain the lack of the transitional forms. This is a real problem for them. Now, the reason it's a real problem is because for evolution to be true, they say evolution is happening all the time, all around us. They're talking genetics again. That's that bait and switch. Always watch that. Always test that and watch. And you'll see that when they talk about real scientific evolution, they're always talking what? Genetics. Real science. But they ignore the fact that they do the bait and switch to say, well, that proves that the crocodile should exist. You know, a crocodile with a duck head. You know, they mock, Ray Comfort for coming up with a crocoduck. But it should be there. There should be something that shows us this transition from one kind to another. But when we look at the fossil record, and that's your next one there, number 4 there, the fossil record, that's number 4, fossil record, that's your blank. The fossil record, one chief basis of the theory has been grossly misinterpreted. In other words, when we look at the fossil record, we don't see any transitional forms. And the things we do see, that they try to argue to show this is evolution. Look, we have it. It's grossly misinterpreted, if not completely outright lies. I remember when a friend of mine, Carl Kirby, did a talk that he has on I forget what the actual name of it was, but it was called The Missing Link was the show. They had a website, The Missing Link. A documentary called The Missing Link. Throughout the whole thing, they argue that this animal looks very much like, I forget what it was, the type that it looked like. I have to try to remember, but they explain that it looks like a squirrel or something like that. And then they argue that this is really a chimpanzee. It's like things like that they do. There's a gentleman here in my home state of New Jersey. He's a dentist, and got to meet him. He's spending his life as a dentist. He decided to start looking into the jaw bones of these fossils that they argue are the transitional forms between chimpanzees or apes to man. One of the things that he noticed, being an expert in Jaws, was, and I'm not talking Jaws, the big shark from the movie from the 80s, Jaws like this part of your mouth that's moving, like mine is, to make sounds, that has teeth in them. He noticed that a lot of the teeth were like filed down or changed to make it fit. The jaw bones were filed so that they would make them look either more human or less human. And he noticed that there would be times in some of the fossils where they'd have a chimpanzee skull or a human skull with a chimpanzee or human jawbone of the opposite. So you'd have a human skull with a chimpanzee lower part of the jaw, or the reverse. Okay, human skull with a chimpanzee bone, lower jaw, or a human lower jaw and a chimpanzee. It's like they play games like that. That shows the dishonesty that they have. Okay, they know what they're doing when they do things like that. In this one documentary on The Missing Link, I think it was called Ida, I think is what they called it. And in this thing, they go on to kind of show how to fit things together. They realized things didn't fit, and they had to like file them down to make it fit. What are they doing? They're making assumptions. They had like I think it was in that one where they had a pelvic bone. Okay, the pelvic bone, and they knew it didn't fit their starting presupposition. Their presupposition was evolution is true, and this was a missing link. So what they had to do to get it to work was actually kind of break it and file it down so that it fit perfectly, so that this pelvic bone would fit the transitional form. That's not being honest, is it? Okay, so what we see is evolutionists can't explain the lack of transitional forms. That's number 3. Number 4 is that the fossil record, one of the chief basis for the theory of evolution, has been grossly misinterpreted. Okay? It's been grossly misinterpreted. And I don't want to underestimate that. Okay? Because this shows the dishonesty that they're doing. All right? When people argue and they try to make you feel that you're some sort of knucklehead because you don't believe in evolution, the reality is that they have been fallen for brainwashing. Now, when someone says there's a missing link, that's brainwashing. There's nothing missing. There is no link. It is their religious belief that tells them that there must be a missing link. Therefore, they believe it's there. Therefore, they try to prove that there is one. There's no evidence of a missing link. There's no evidence in the fossil record, and we don't see the transitional forms, which we should see if evolution is still ongoing. These are major issues, and you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure this out and ask these simple questions if someone's trying to argue with you that evolution is true. Oh wait, they usually don't. Because once you deny evolution, they usually just write you off as an idiot and walk away. You know why? Oh, that's right, it's their religious belief. In other words, they don't want to hear the truth. They want to stay in the suppression of truth in their unrighteousness. And it's for that reason that they're going to go in any way they can to try to not think about truth. Okay? They don't want to think about it. They don't want to see it. They don't want to hear it. None of that. Okay? This is the reality that you have to understand. Okay, so we say that just so you understand there's nothing for you to fear. All right? When they argue for evolution, 1, there's no evidence that evolution's ongoing. 2, real science, the study of genetics, something we could observe and reproduce even in laboratories, shows that we only lose information and we don't gain it. 3, evolutionists can't explain the lack of transitional forms. I love the one letter that was written to a guy that did a book on evolution that was from a museum, and they argued, why don't you put in some transitional forms? And he says there aren't any. There's no evidence of some. And the person was arguing that they should draw some in, and that's exactly what they do. They start with a starting point, an ape. They start with an ending point, a man, and they draw pictures. And the only place that those pictures in the middle actually exist is in textbooks, not real science journals. Okay? It's only in the textbooks. Why? Because they're teaching a religion. All right. So the fossil record, one of the chief bases for the theory of evolution, has been grossly misinterpreted. Those are the first 4. Here is the 5th. Number 5 in your syllabus. Evolution offers no answer for morality. That's your blank there, for morality. In other words, chemical reactions do not produce morality. Chemicals do not produce or develop an ethical system of right and wrong. I love what my buddy Sai says. He argues it this way, and I love to do this with people. It's a great illustration. You take a can of soda, you shake it up, and ask them what comes out. You get different answers, but fizz, okay. You get fizz. Is the fizz right or wrong? Now, some will not understand the question and be like, well, it was wrong if it wasn't your soda. No. That wasn't, and yeah, I say soda, I don't call it pop. Okay? I'm not from the Midwest. I talk proper English. It's soda. Soda. Pop, please. And it's not, and then those that shorten it to pop. You only call it pop because you can't handle 2 syllables. Soda. It's all right. 2 syllables is fine. But what we end up seeing is you know, they'll say, well, you know, is that morally right or wrong? Well, it's neither, right? I mean, you take soda and you shake it up. It's not morally right and it's not morally wrong. Why? Because it just is. That's right. It just is. And I'll often ask someone, this is the issue. Because what are they saying? They're going, oh, the chemical reactions have to create morality. Why? Because they believe you're wrong. How can you say I'm wrong? You can't even explain how there could be morality. See, chemical reactions can't produce morality. All right? So, what do we end up with? We end up having the reality that we know there are things that are right and wrong. Yeah, I know. Some of them try to argue, no, there is no right and wrong. Oh, okay. So killing little children just for fun or raping babies just for fun, that's right? No, it isn't. No one in their right mind would say that. But not all atheists, those religious people, they're not all in a right mind. Because they'll actually try to argue that wrong is perfectly fine as long as they don't have to admit that they have a religious belief, okay, that they can't explain where morality comes from. So what do? They are stuck with the reality of morality, but no way to explain or account for that morality. That's the issue, okay? The evolution has no offer for morality. They cannot account for chemical reactions creating morality. And they'll argue, no, it's the chemical reactions in your brain. Okay, we have chemical reactions in our brain. That doesn't make it right or wrong. It just makes it what it is. Some will argue animals show evidence of a ethical system. Okay, this may gross you out. Too bad, it just is. Vampire bats. They fly out at night. They find a cow. They sink their teeth into the cow. They suck some blood. They come back to the nest. And one of the things that has been observed with vampire bats is that they all huddle together in a cold cave. They hang upside down. They draw close to one another, and they have to stay close to one another to stay warm and protect each other. Okay, to stay warm. But when some of them that don't have food, they weren't able to find some cow or animal to get blood, they will actually share blood one another, share some of the food. So they sorry, it's going to be gross, but they actually regurgitate the blood back into the mouth of another vampire bat. But if one vampire bat does not share, all of the bats seem to shun that bat and push him out of the collective, and that bat stays by himself and dies. You see a similar thing with the emperor penguins, where if one of them does not allow for, because of the cold, they huddle together and they kind of rotate around so that they all stay, come to the center and work their way out to outside, so others get in the center and they work their way in a circle, day in and day out, and that's what they do. Well, when we see that, we'll see sometimes observed where one doesn't try to, doesn't let others, doesn't get out of the center, basically, tries to stay inside and won't let others push them out so that they can stay warm. And those will push them, that emperor penguin, out altogether. They all work together, push him out, and he freezes to death and dies. That's just the reality. Is that an ethical system? I mean, have you ever seen them set up a court of law? Have they said lying is wrong, stealing is wrong, murder is wrong? No, you see, that's a difference. They do it by instinct because God gave them that instinct so that they can stay alive. Okay? That is not proof that chemical reactions create an ethical system. It doesn't prove that right is wrong, right is right and wrong is wrong. Because what every scientist knows is that chemical reactions cannot produce immaterial things like morality. Okay? So this is the thing. We realize we shouldn't be worried when people come up with evolution, because evolution is easily refuted in these 5 simple things. So if you remember these 5 simple things, not a problem. Okay? 1, there's no evidence that evolution we're talking about, that man came from animals, lower animals, we have no evidence that's ongoing. Real science like genetics proves that we can only lose information, not gain it. The fact that evolutionists cannot explain for the lack of transitional forms. The fact that the fossil record has been grossly misinterpreted. And that fails to show evidence of any transitional forms too, by the way. We should see tons of evidence of transitional forms in the fossil record. But what do we see when we look at the fossil record? We see animals in their kind, not having been changed, fully formed as they are, not changing. And then we see that evolution has no offer for morality. Okay, and so the last part that you see there is it must be understood that evolution is a theory. A theory. So that's your blank there. It must be understood that evolution is a theory and not a scientific fact. From a Christian standpoint, the primary problem with evolution is that the theory undermines the integrity of the Bible, specifically the creation account found in the first chapter of Genesis. Now, I'm going to go into in next class a theory that some people have tried to postulate to try to accept what the world says is really proven science and what they see in the Bible so that they can merge those together and kind of go, oh, we have an answer. Okay, and it's called theistic evolution. We're going to look at that in next class. But when we talk about evolution as a theory, remember what they do, what these people that believe in evolution do. They start off with a real science like genetics. They see something that's observable, repeatable. They take that, they make that which is true, even though it proves the other theory of evolution absolutely wrong. They use that to say, well, then this one must be true. Okay? And so that is a problem. So this is the thing. It is a theory. In other words, it's not a law. It's not something provable. Now, there's three things when you look at the scientific method. You start with a hypothesis. In other words, someone comes up with an argument. Man came from chimpanzees. That's a hypothesis. You look for some evidence to disprove that. And if you can't find any, or to support it, and if you can't find any, what do? It becomes a theory. If you find some evidence to support that hypothesis, it'll become a theory. When you have enough evidence, when you find that there's no way to disprove that theory, and there's lots of evidence to support that theory, it becomes a law. Now, therefore, I'm saying if it is a theory of evolution, there must be some evidence for it, correct? That's right. What is the evidence? The evidence is for genetics. The evidence is for the fact that we see adaptation within a kind of animal. What we don't see is what people often think of as evolution. One kind of animal becoming another kind of animal. That's what's missing. Okay? That's where, when you break the theory of evolution down into special evolution, genetics, that's actually a law. That's true, repeatable, we know it's fact. General evolution, that macroevolution, hypothesis completely, because there's no evidence for it. Okay? Every time you hear them try to make the evidence for that general evolution, what are they doing? They are arguing for a religious claim, a religious belief. And if you press that, you're going to see it, because they'll start using really scientific words like probably, could have been, might have been, could be, might be. That's not science, okay? You'll quickly see that they will leave the realm of science and use science as a philosophy. No one observed the creation of man except for God. So the only one that can tell us what really happened is Him. And we're going to look next week at what He says about creation of man. Not next week, next class. I should make that real clear. Next class. And you're going to see why in a moment. But the point being is that we're going to see what God says about the creation of man, and we're going to see, when we look at it, we're going to see what some people falsely do to try to argue, okay, to try to bring together the world's view and the Bible's view, all right? So that will be in next class, but next week we will not have class. No class next week. No, no, no. All right? No class next week. Why do I say that? Because I will not be around. All right? I am going to be taking a couple of days. I'll be going down to a place that I like to go every few years, America's Keswick. Beautiful place for me to go, relax. I will be down there for 2-3 days. I will be just sitting, reading a Bible, spending some time walking and praying and working on my book on evangelism. And so I won't be taking phone calls, except for by my wife. She always gets answered. She calls, I pick up, or my kids. But I won't be taking phone calls. I won't have electronics other than the computer that will be there for me to write the book, and I will just have my Bible and a lot of quiet time. So there will be no class next week. I'm sorry about that, but that's the way it is. But if you do have any questions, you can email us at academy@strivingforeternity.org. We'll seek to answer your questions. You can go to our Facebook page, just search for the Striving for Eternity Facebook group, and you can ask to join that. And if you're a nice fellow, nice individual, maybe we'll let you. And if you're an atheist, sorry, we don't let you in. We have some rules. That's just our rules. The Facebook group is for a fellowship of like-minded believers that want to study the scriptures together, talk, and have good theological discussions based on the class and the ministry. So that's going to be that. You can email us. But coming up in just like 18 days, wow, not that far away, is the Ohio Fire. The Ohio Fire Memorial Day weekend. You can go to ohiofire.org. Paul Taylor, Cy Tembrunkate, Michael Coughlin, and yours truly. Okay, the other three are worth listening to at least. But ohiofire.org, some great topics. We'll hear from Cy about presuppositional apologetics. We'll hear from Paul about why creation matters. What does it have to do with sharing the gospel? How does Genesis, why is it a big deal? So we'll look at that. Jersey Fire is in July, the second weekend in July, the 12th and 13th. We'll have Jason Lyle, we'll have Cy Tembrunkate, myself, Will Costello, and the theme will be presuppositional apologetics. So if you don't have your copy of How to Answer the Fool, you may want to go and get a big dose of that there. Presuppositional apologetics is the theme. And then in September, late September, we'll have the NorCal Fire. That's going to be a good event. We're going to be answering why theology matters, how it affects different worldviews. That's going to be a great conference. You can go to the spreadingthefire.org and find out about all of them, and new ones as they're added. We'll be adding hopefully a new one each year. If you want one in your area, contact us through the website, let us know, and we'll talk to you about adding one in your area. There are some different ones that are in discussions, and we're praying about it, and hopefully I'll have one in your area. Lastly, if you're in my area, in Jackson, New Jersey, come out to Faith Bible Church, and you can join with Pastor Will Costello and myself. This is part of a church revitalization, a very small beginning, but we are just beginning. We're rewriting our Constitution from scratch. We're starting over with everything, and we are writing, starting to really revitalizing a church that was almost ready to close its doors. And Pastor Will and I have some great men in this church that are very biblically minded, and so all of us are really trying to build a good, firm foundation for a church in Jackson, New Jersey. So if you're in the area, you want to come out, you come visit us, and we'd love to have you. If you're just passing through on a Sunday, come and join us. We'd enjoy having you. There's a lot of preachers street preachers that come through, and our church loves to have street preachers coming through and stopping in. So we would love to have you stop in. Lastly is our person to encourage, and this person is someone that we put out for encouragement before, But some of you are really bad encouragers. So you got to make up for it this time, okay? In other words, why do we do this? We have a brother or sister of encouragement with each class because we want you to go out and encourage others, okay? We want you to build that in to something that you would do, all right? Even if you don't know the person, get to know the person, all right? The next person is a man who I've gotten to go out on evangelism, different outreaches, Super Bowl outreach, got to go to London with him. But I got to tell you, son, he is one of the men in my life that I love to disagree with theologically. And you go, what? Yeah. Because when we disagree, it's like iron sharpening iron. I mean, this brother digs into the scriptures. Not only can he preach like amazingly, I love to listen to him preach. I love when he's out on the streets and he's bringing forth the gospel because he really brings it on the streets. But this brother not only brings it on the streets, but when he digs into the scriptures, I mean, he and I will sit and disagree, and we're pulling out the Greek, and we're pulling out, all the different tools to understand the Bible, and we're getting into the context, and that's the kind of guy that Bobby McCurry is. He is a guy, his ministry is totheendoftheearth.org. Go there, find him on Facebook. He'll be tagged in our Striving for Eternity Facebook group, if not already, pretty shortly. And go there and check him out. Get to know him. He's got like one of the coolest beards you can imagine. No, but he does. He's got this really long beard. We were in England. I wanted to put one of those Muslim hats on him because he looked like he was just like a Muslim in training. But he's just such a sweet guy. He's like a big teddy bear. He really is. But this guy is so serious about the scriptures and wants to be so faithful to the scriptures. And that's what I love about him. He will sit and study the scriptures with you and study them out. And so I want you to encourage him. He is full-time in evangelism. He's down in the Atlanta area. So if you're down there, get to know him. He goes on to college campuses and he goes out regularly sharing the gospel. He goes out to abortion clinics. He does some traveling. And so he does get out. I want you to encourage him, especially because a lot of you guys didn't last time that we mentioned him. And he said there was only a few people that actually even said anything. So I really want you guys to make a big effort to make sure that you get to know him, encourage him, because he's a very, very solid brother who wants to be accurate in the Word of God, and he wants to be faithful to the proclamation of the Word of God. And he's on the streets and the front lines doing it. So be praying for him and be encouraging him this week. Want to encourage you just to make sure you enroll, get a syllabus with us. If you can, and you can help support us monthly. I know those of you who watch live would love to get rid of the ads. We would love to get rid of them too. We just cannot afford it on our budget. It costs us $300 a month that has to come in for us to do that. And so if we can raise that, there is a way on the website, which is down there. You can go and do a monthly, under the donate button, you can donate monthly, and you can mention in there, it's for the Academy. When we get that set up to have $300 there, we're going to get rid of the ads for you. But you can go to the Striving for Eternity Academy on the website and get yourself that way. Oh, okay. One of the syllabuses right over here, and you can pick yourself up a syllabus, and we really, people ask about that we mention the fact that we want you to enroll. We want people to enroll. Yes, it does cost us money to make the syllabuses and everything, but that's all we charge. We don't make money off it. Literally, the couple of dollars that we get that isn't the cost of the syllabus, we make up by giving you other things throughout the year. All right? Those that enroll. But there's some people who give above and beyond and have given to donate for others. And so I do want to mention that. If you want a syllabus, you really want to be able to get some of the benefits of the students that the students have that enroll, especially as we are working on creating a student portal for the website. that's going to be one of the benefits of enrolling. We have people that donate for subscriptions, so you can have a subscription. So make sure you contact us and say, you know what, I really can't afford it, but because we don't want money to be an issue. You want to become a student, you let us know, and we're going to find a way to get you the materials, okay? So there will be no class next week, okay? Please remember that. No class next week, but we will pick up the week after that, and we'll have continue this lesson, and therefore we'll move into theistic evolution and then a biblical view of the creation of man. So until then, remember to strive to make today an eternal day for the glory of God.